Hello, everybody. Welcome to session 3A, Building Community Resilience. This is the second of a series of panel discussions. I'm going to wait until the top of the hour to get us started, just to make sure that everybody who wants to join is able to get in. Great. Welcome, everybody. It's now at the top of the hour. Welcome to session 3A, the second in a series of sessions on building community resilience. My name is Richard Moss. I'm a senior scientist at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I had the privilege during the first Managed Retreat Conference at Columbia to actually be in residence at Columbia, which was really very exciting. I just want to thank the organizing committee and the organizers of the meeting for really a great set of sessions. As I mentioned, we're building on prior community resilience sessions. There were great talks during the opening plenary from Jackie Patterson and A.R. Siders, and a great panel discussion that followed that with officials from New York City, Miami, and Vancouver, and then a community resilience panel immediately following that also had quite a diverse set of presentations. And across these prior sessions, we've had a range of issues that were raised related to the inequitable distribution of privilege and vulnerability and the impacts that has on managed retreat, engagement issues, questions of self-determination, presentations that focused on the use of modeling to support managed retreat, and issues related to physical dimensions of resilience. So really quite a diverse set. And we're going to be continuing that diversity in this session. We have 6 presentations. Each presenter will have 12 minutes to present, and then we have about 15 minutes for discussion at the end of the session if everybody stays on time. I just want to note to the participants out there that there is a short lag between what you're hearing and what we're doing. And so I just want to encourage everyone, if you do have questions, to pose them in the Q&A early and often, so that we can get them organized and posed promptly to the speakers. And I just will also say I'm not going to give long introductions for the speakers. I'm just going to announce each title and speaker, but the workshop hub has all the bios that we need. So our first talk today is Enabling Homeowners to Adapt to Coastal Flooding, the case of Rockaway in New York City. Malgosia Madajewicz from the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University will be giving that talk. Malgosia, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. This is research on which I have a number of partners listed on this slide, including Stevens Institute of Technology, New York Hall of Science, and the Rockaway Initiative for Sustainability and Equity, which has the wonderful acronym of RISE. Actually, before I keep talking too much longer, I should probably check, can people hear me and see my slides okay? Can I get a thumbs up? Yeah, okay, great, thanks. Okay, so the question that motivates this research is what can help urban communities to prepare for flooding? It's not focused directly on managed retreat, but it does have some implications for it, and I'll explain shortly. So this work is set in New York City, where Hurricane Sandy really accelerated efforts to build resilience to coastal flooding. And since then, the city and various partners have put quite a bit of effort into having meetings, so neighborhood meetings, town hall meetings with residents in coastal areas to build awareness about flood risk and motivate residents to prepare for flooding. Our research suggests that despite 9 years worth now of these meetings, awareness about future flood risk is fairly low among residents in coastal areas. And by and large, people really haven't started to prepare, haven't started to act. There are occasional houses that have been raised here and there, but not on any large scale. And Bill Selecki discussed some research to this effect earlier this morning as well. Hence, we're looking for ways to get this kind of behavioral change started. Our focus is in the Rockaway area of New York, which is this barrier peninsula, thin barrier peninsula here. This map shows the 1% chance flooding. These darker blue areas here are actually water. So in Rockaway, we've been aiming to begin a conversation about preparing for flooding. And we have started with residents who are organized and interested in the topic. So we've been engaging mainly homeowner associations, civic associations, and we've been engaging them through RISE, one of our partners, who is a very trusted kind of partner in Rockaway, has been working there for a long time, is a coalition of community groups. So working with our community group partners, leaders of several collaborating community groups, we have co-produced a series of 3 workshops. The first focuses on risk of flooding, the second 2 on adaptation actions. And we've conducted 2 of these series plus another for a total of 7 workshops. In this work, we have focused very much on what flood risk individual homeowners face and what they can do to reduce flood damages, which may seem odd since preparation for flooding is necessarily requires collective decision-making. The reason we have focused on individual homeowners is one of our hypotheses about why people haven't been changing their behavior yet is that people really need to understand their own individual flood risk, how it affects them and their home, as well as what it is that they can do about that risk in order to be motivated to engage in collective action and in order to be able to engage in that collective action in an informed way. The other important component of what we've been doing is we've been conveying very place and person specific information. And the reason for that, again, is another hypothesis as to why people haven't been changing behavior is that the information about flood risk that they've been getting in prior meetings is not sufficiently specific to decisions that homeowners can make, and that giving more relevant, specific information may be more powerful in changing the way that people think. And I'll show you, and in fact, we have found that flood risks and benefits and costs of adaptation options differ quite a bit across households, even in this narrow, low-lying peninsula that Rockaway is, because they differ by elevation, even small differences in elevation, by whether or not homes have basements and so forth. So we've really focused on giving very kind of person-specific information, and I'll give an example of that in just a minute. We also have a research design around this to evaluate the effectiveness of this engagement. In particular, we're hoping to learn in this very diverse urban area. I think I didn't mention in the beginning, it's a very densely populated area with very diverse community profiles. In this very diverse area, we wanted to see under what conditions engaging with leaders of community groups through this intensive co-production process, which requires time and resources, can be effective in engaging those groups in then passing on the information to other group members and the rest of the community, and getting the community to kind of take ownership of this process and continue preparations of flooding on their own with possibly a different form of support required at that point, not this kind of co-production engagement that we're engaging in. Or does this co-production engagement needs to be undertaken more broadly to elicit a change in behavior? So we're actually conducting surveys to compare outcomes before and after among different sets of community groups that have participated in the project in different ways, and also groups that have not participated, but have had access to prior meetings with the city and online information developed by the city for residents. So with apologies, I'm going to go through the next 9 slides. I'm just going to fly through them super fast. What I want to do in those slides is to give you a flavor of what I mean by place and person specific information that we've been providing. So we have actually showed people flood maps, but they are specific to neighborhoods. And we are showing them, the colors show different depths, and we've shown them for different frequency of flooding. And we show change in flooding from the 2020s to 2050, so sort of the period of a typical home mortgage. We've also shown how different frequency flood levels look like on popular local landmarks. So there's a change from 2020 to 2050. We have then picked a specific address in Rockaway, specific addresses in different parts, and shown people what the flood risk is at specific addresses, where again, it differs quite widely depending on elevation and characteristics of the home. We also have data from prior research that have allowed us to tell people on average how much can they expect to spend on recovery, on repair of repetitive flood damages at their elevation with kind of average home characteristics. So we have been providing that information for that specific address. We showed how that recovery cost changes with elevation, and it changes quite dramatically, somewhere between 1.5 and about 3 feet. So it's different for different residents. We went through a number of different adaptation options and shown, based on recovery costs, what are the benefits in terms of avoided future damages, avoided future costs of repair over 15 years and 30 years of undertaking a particular action for a broad menu of actions. And how do those benefits compare to the costs, what implications they have for insurance premium and so on. So we haven't yet, that's the kind of, and the information that I just showed you, we also developed sort of individual flood risk profiles and benefits and costs of different actions for individuals, for their addresses, for any participant in the workshop who wanted one, only if they wanted one, of course. We haven't finished our evaluation yet, but just based on the participants in the workshop, so we just finished the workshops a week ago, our preliminary insights are that going through these individual risks and the individual options has been really useful to participants in their own words. It's the participants who are among the most engaged and most organized of residents were surprisingly uninformed about flood risk coming into the workshops. They really had not related kind of future flood risk to what happens at their home, had not considered cost of doing nothing, were thought of options as mainly involving raising their home. And if they didn't have the money to raise their home, well, then they wouldn't do anything. There weren't other options available. Most had not seen online information created specifically for residents. So going through this individual level information, increased this. So they came to us with the idea that they were interested in learning more about flooding, and they were quite angry at the city for the fact that Rockaway had not happened in Rockaway over the last 9 years to prepare the area for flooding, but not with a sense that they not prepared to take any action themselves. And going through this process, by the second workshop, there was a real sense of urgency where the conversation changed to participants saying, we need to act. There are things we can do. We need to act, and we need to act now. They found this idea of a menu of options that each different actions might be appropriate for different residents, and that there was also a menu of collective strategies for collective action. They found this very empowering. It was empowering to them to be able to think, okay, we have these options. What makes sense for us? What makes sense for me? What makes sense for my community? Thinking through individual risk and their ability to address that risk on their own led them to really identify the need to organize across the peninsula and take collective action. They were saying, not only do we need to pass this information on in our groups, we need to organize across community groups, get behind a plan for resilience for Rockaway that we want to see. And they began to consider whether they should relocate. And I guess that's my timer. I have one more slide. I'll be quick. So at the beginning, they weren't ready to consider the issue of relocating at all. But by the end, this was definitely an item on the menu that they wanted to talk about. So I'll just say very briefly, by the end, they said that engagement by residents is critical. They discussed some planning challenges, but they came away with a plan for next steps where they plan to continue to meet quarterly and hope to advance the process of planning for flood resilience. And we'll see how it goes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Malgosia. That's a really great talk and really interesting to hear about how the different approaches to communicating likelihood have affected people's willingness to take action. Our next talk is going to be on inclusive approaches and community-focused climate resilience partnerships by Rupu Gupta from Knology. Rupu.
Thank you, Richard. I'm just about to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen? I see head nods. Perfect. Yep. Thank you. I'll just start the slideshow. Excellent. Hi, everyone. I'm Rupu Gupta. I'm a conservation psychologist and a researcher at Knology, which is a social science research organization where our main office is based in New York City. My talk is going to be about an NSF-funded project called CASL, or Communities Advancing Science Literacy, that aims to advance climate resilience through collaborations between informal science learning organizations like zoos and aquariums and community organizations that are focused more on environmental and social justice issues. Knology was the research and evaluation partner in this project, and we worked closely with the New England Aquarium in Boston, Massachusetts, and the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, to really study their community building processes. And 2 case studies emerged from these cities as they began to co-develop science-based resilience plans that were relevant to their local communities. So the communities of focus in this project were East Boston, which is shown in this picture, and Long Beach in this next picture, that are both surrounded by water on all sides. So it's a nice follow-up to Malgosia's talk just now. They're very vulnerable to flooding, so ecologically vulnerable, but also very socially vulnerable because it's economically disadvantaged and the community overall has a sense of marginalization. So this was the context for the project that I'm going to describe. We started by thinking about what community resilience might mean in this context, and Frankenberger's definition proved very helpful in this regard because it talks about a system's ability to tackle and grow in many different ways when we're dealing with stressors, and then creating conditions that help renew and grow in a broad inclusive way. So this definition made it amenable to think about resilience in many different forms that might be relevant for these communities. And these included infrastructural changes that could happen involving built and physical aspects of the community, as well as ecological ones, which would involve natural systems and rebuilding those that are embedded in the neighborhoods. And importantly, resilience at the human level that could take on individual as well as personal capacities, and also community capacities and collective capacities for the community to act together. So these were all the possibilities. There were lots of possibilities. And as the evaluation partners, we were really interested in hearing from the communities about their perceptions of what would make their community stronger. So as part of designing the study, we had to be flexible and really be responsive to the various circumstances of the stakeholders who were part of this process. And these stakeholders were the aquarium staff, the staff from the community-based organizations, as well as community residents. So participatory action research was really important for us, and it grounded the work because we had to co-develop tools and coordinate activities with all these stakeholders, thinking of them as equal contributors and engaging them as collaborators in this process. Cultural responsiveness was a big part as well, because we had to be mindful of the different needs and priorities of all these partners. We chose to focus on the community organizations as a starting point before going into the communities, because we wanted to really understand their perspectives. And so we engaged them as informed observers and really reshaped their role in the project to be the eyes and ears of what was happening in the communities, because they were a key partner as well in the process. And so to create these meaningful and collective sharing experiences, we conducted virtual workshops to ensure they were able to join. We also had to be very creative in the process with the kinds of data we collected, because we weren't directly connecting with the communities. We did an artifact review of all the events, products, and outputs that were created through the project. And this really allowed us to tell the story of what the project created, what it led to in an authentic way. Finally, finally, we had to be pragmatic as well in the process, because right from the start, we had to be realistic about what outcomes we would see in this 2-year time span of the study. Resilience planning is a really long-term process, and 2 years is not enough to see tangible changes. So we wanted to be really focused on what was possible in this time frame. For this reason, the partnership development process became paramount to kind of the longer term changes we would want to see. We were especially interested in how people with very different perspectives, very different disciplinary backgrounds came together and identified shared priorities. As a result, the data was mostly qualitative. The lessons we learned were many, and it started with how in both case studies, for the community members, resilience took on many different connotations. Improving the socioeconomic conditions were a huge priority. They wanted more affordable housing, more jobs, more financial stability, and more educational opportunities. And they were keenly aware that they were a frontline community, as the community partners shared with us. They were also very concerned about the unhealthy environmental and ecological conditions where they lived. Lack of green spaces, poor air quality, these were all part of their daily lived experiences. And they were also very aware of the consequences of all these on the community's health and well-being. So they were very concerned, very alarmed about these environmental conditions, with a sense of hopelessness as it's related to thinking about how climate change was impacting them. However, strengthening the community by building social capital was also very, very important, because there was a sense of disconnect, of not knowing about each other's neighbors, not knowing who lives in the same space that they did, but wanting to engage more and wanting to bond more with each other. and this kind of manifests in a feeling that they lacked social as well as political capital, and they wanted greater representation so that their voices could be heard. Overall, a basic quality of life issues emerged, as you can tell, as the highest priorities that needed to be addressed to really think about community resilience in this context. So as a result of these initial findings, a number of different projects and programs were created by the aquarium as well as the community partners. For example, this happened in Long Beach, where a community event was created to share personal stories and community knowledge so that it was an opportunity for the community to come together. Similarly, in Boston, the New England Aquarium co-developed programs that involved youth in local cleanups of beaches, of creeks, wetlands, and also programs to reduce plastic use. As the project wrapped up, the role of equity and inclusion became really strongly evident. Inequity was inherent in the project context right from the start. If you think about it, there were really stark power asymmetries that existed between the aquariums and their community partners in terms of the resources they held and the profile that they had in the community. So the project underscored the role of relationship building and the role of inclusive practices as essentially the foundation to co-create community resilience efforts. It was really critical to acknowledge and be transparent about the different power dynamics at play between these different groups. And a level of cultural competence was needed to engage authentically with partners with whom the aquariums had never really engaged in before. So a big priority for the aquariums moving forward is to build that institutional capacity and develop the culture within the organizations to continue these long-term partnerships. And funnily, or for better or for worse, the project completion coincided with the pandemic and the racial justice movements that erupted last summer. And in this context, the need for cultural competence was even more apparent as the systemic inequalities in health, safety, resources, and quality of life were receiving a lot of national attention. They were brought to life in these community contexts as well, where these partnerships were being aimed. And it really helped rethink the role of these informal learning organizations as important partners to be part of these community resilience processes and how their role might be redefined. So for the future of these local partnerships, some important questions do remain. Thinking about climate risk these communities face, thinking about where they are located, their needs as articulated. Conversations about climate risk, for instance, will need to be carefully balanced in light of the emotional and very difficult nature of these conversations, right? That communities' relationship with nature and ecology in their local settings is quite fragile. And relocation too is a stressful topic. And talking about how to balance preparing the infrastructure in the future, which is really abstract, with sort of thinking about the economic, social, and psychological toll for the residents. So these are things that will need to be part of future conversations. However, the study did highlight that there are opportunities and that they did create a foundation to build on CASL to continue these conversations in inclusive, equitable ways with multiple partners at the table and really thinking about resilience in a holistic sense. And with that, thank you very much. Our report based on this project is available on our website, which I'm happy to share. And we're in the middle of a publication as well based on this. So thank you very much.
Rupu, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. Really enjoyed hearing about the role of the informal organizations and wondering what the implications are for an administration that's very interested in seeing action. How can they build on that informal approach, but through government programs?
Okay.
So we'll come back to that, I hope, in our discussion period.
I hope so too.
Yep. Our next talk is going to be incorporating individual and household financial literacy, preparedness, and well-being into planning for managed retreat. Joshua DeVincenzo and Christopher Tingley from the National Center for Disaster Preparedness at the Earth Institute at Columbia. Josh or Chris, take it away.
Great. First, I want to thank you, Richard, for moderating, and to the conference organizers. We hope to continue to build momentum on the previous two presentations and lead to a fruitful discussion. As Richard had mentioned, our title of our presentation is going to be Incorporating Individual and Household Financial Literacy, Preparedness and Wellbeing for Planning for Managed Retreat. And I'm fortunate enough to be sharing the virtual stage with Chris Tingley.
So hi, everyone. My name is Chris Tingley. I'm a Master's of Public Administration candidate at Columbia, and I came to grad school to learn the tools necessary to implement sustainable and equitable disaster recovery. I'm really fortunate to be a research assistant at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, and I'm a member of Climate Migration Network's Law and Policy Working Group.
And as I mentioned before, my name is Josh DeVincenzo. I'm a senior instructional designer at NCDP. Currently, we work on a suite of curriculum on disaster financial literacy, and we're fortunate enough to deploy it around the country. So we've gained a lot of insights on this topic and the intersection between disaster financial literacy. So looking forward to engaging in this conversation. To do so, we do have a few aims. We want to engage the research and practice community in a discussion on the importance of financial literacy for individuals and households that are participating in the managed retreat programs, primarily focusing on buyouts today. We want to position individual and household disaster financial literacy as a mitigation strategy, as well as provide some recommendations for further research, as well as some immediate curriculum considerations out in the field. Just to get on board on the same page with everybody, we know many of these definitions have different versions out there, different ones we like to subscribe to, but for the sake of our presentation, we'll be referring to managed retreat as a strategic relocation of structures or abandonment of land. We'll be talking about buyouts in the sense of voluntary acquisition of flood-prone or flood-damaged homes. And then financial literacy, the ability to use knowledge and skills to manage financial resources effectively for a lifetime of financial well-being, with the ultimate goal there. And then financial education, just the process by which people can improve their understanding of financial products, services, concepts, so they're empowered to make informed decisions, avoid pitfalls, and know where to go for help.
So home buyouts have been a major strategy for implementing managed retreat in the US for a long time, and they've been long considered a cost-effective and a meaningful method for moving people out of harm's way. But what we were really interested in figuring out is how individual and household finances were impacted by buyouts. And I'll just note that throughout our presentation, we may refer to individuals and households as IH. And historically, the financial concerns of households, and especially at-risk, marginalized, and low-income households, are not considered until after a disaster, at which point there's significant gaps in equity that already exist and are difficult to address. We also know that in existing training curriculum and research, there's a real lack of connection between financial well-being and managed retreat. And thus, we hope that by pointing to some potential connections between the two areas, we will have our audience consider the convergence of financial literacy, particularly disaster financial literacy, and managed retreat. And this is incredibly important to address now, because as research and news coverage continues to uncover the deep inequalities of not only disasters, but disaster aid, we've also seen that many researchers have pointed out in the last few years that buyouts as a form of mitigation are not immune to these inequalities. I know today a number of presentations have already mentioned, but while buyouts are more common in whiter and wealthier counties, it's actually predominantly neighborhoods of color and low-income areas in those counties that end up accepting buyout offers. And further, we don't know a whole lot about the long-term impacts of relocation due to buyouts. Most buyouts that have been implemented to date stop collecting data on participants once their old property has been sold. And recently I was in a presentation just before this where a researcher was going through all of the work that they were trying to uncover to understand that process of how people move and where, and it's a lot. And so researchers have already been highlighting this gap, questioning why over 40,000 homes were purchased in the last 30 years through buyouts, but there's no national review being conducted on its effectiveness. And some researchers have gone so far as to wonder if we can really learn from our previous buyouts and improve our policy if we're not tracking the long-term implications of it on participants. In fact, some research that we'll talk about in a little while have already called into question whether buyouts as they exist are actually reducing vulnerabilities. So there are a bunch of gaps in how we see that buyout policies are being implemented. And a big one is around communication. Multiple levels of bureaucracy can make the rationales behind buyout policies confusing, and a sense of involuntariness in voluntary buyouts can be driven by a fear of the social and economic impacts of being left behind. Cost benefit analysis, which FEMA uses to determine whether buyouts are an effective mitigation strategy, can be flawed and exacerbate any existing inequalities, while long timelines, sometimes up to 3 to 4 years post-disaster, can reduce interest in buyouts and lead to disaster survivors making temporary repairs to homes so that they're livable. And if these repairs are funded through disaster recovery grants, that can reduce the final buyout price of a home due to duplication of benefit policies. Interestingly, though, financial incentives alone, increasing the amount of money someone receives for their home, may not solve the post-buyout housing challenges for participants, especially in high cost of living areas like New York. And this is particularly concerning given that only a small fraction of buyouts have taken place in coastal areas, but scientists expect 25,000 affordable housing units to be at risk of sea level rise flooding by 2050. Further, the needs of renters really need to be examined. While only 12% of federal buyouts to date have been rental properties, tenants don't really have a say if a landlord decides to sell their home in a buyout. So with buyouts poised to be a continuing and growing mitigation strategy in the future, we believe that understanding the financial drivers of vulnerability and their implications for long-term financial well-being after managed retreat can help inform more effective and equitable buyout policy.
So throughout the literature, there were plenty of examples of financial undertones throughout the process, and we took it upon ourselves to call those out. First and foremost, buyouts, as already been stated, are more common in neighborhoods with relatively lower household incomes and are more socially vulnerable populations. Due to financial constraints, households can feel that accepting a buyout offer is the only viable option. We'll talk a little bit in a couple slides of the importance of financial scenarios and financial situations prior to a disaster, prior to mitigation being an important driver. The slow buyout process may be especially difficult for low-income residents if they have to find alternative housing through the process, which again will increase their housing costs. Next slide, please. Destination communities, or where these households are redirected to, may result in new social and economic opportunities, but may also put pressure on limited resources. Post-Sandy, finding comparable affordable housing elsewhere was a challenge, despite the financial incentives. In the case of Oakwood Beach, New York, financial incentives were highest on record, although incentives did not alleviate the financial burden for buyout participants. So again, encouraging us to investigate further the financial literacy components and financial understanding of these individuals and households. Incentive structures are often an area of confusion. I believe that's been alluded to in the previous two presentations as well, and few participants could explain it clearly. In addition, participants described the confusing and dated nature of the information provided to them. Next slide, please. This is just a quick vignette. I know we're limited on time, so I'm not going to read the entire thing, but this is out of Vander and Greer. And this is from a participant stating that the market had changed. It was not enough to buy the same type of house. You had to show that you had enough money in your account. Eventually, they're not happy because of all the extra expenses that accumulated, which appeared because of moving in and out. Their dream of once paying off their mortgage of their former house before retirement was now long gone, and their current house they will not be able to pay off. They have to change kind of their spending habits here, the keeping money on the side for unforeseeable expenses. So that's like limiting what they can buy now. Next slide, please. So what we know from kind of our prior work with financial literacy and disasters, this is a very commonly cited piece here, but 40% of Americans would struggle paying a $400 unexpected bill without having to dip into any type of credit mechanism. Natural disasters lead to declines in credit scores and mortgage performance, with effects worsening over time. And then individuals who are likely to be struggling financially before the disaster are often the hardest impacted after the disaster. Next slide, please. And one way to look at it, and we use this in some of our trainings that we do on disaster financial literacy, is the SBA loan application process. You can see here in this visual, we have majority of applications being rejected because of many of the things that financial education hopes to address. So you see one of the main drivers here being unsatisfactory credit history, lack of repayment ability, unsatisfactory history on a federal obligation, lack of repayment ability in a different sense there, and many that just stack up in terms of what we can do to be more proactive from a financial literacy education standpoint. Next slide, please. So in certain scenarios, homeowners may be required to implement costly mitigation, i.e. home elevation. For homeowners with limited financial means, of course, this is going to bear a disruption to their finances here. In the context of managed retreat, we must investigate if individual and households are financially prepared, not only for disasters, but also for mitigation here.
So I mentioned earlier that existing research has called into question whether some buyouts have actually reduced vulnerability. Devin McGee in 2017 and their published paper with Binder and Albright in 2020 found that for a Staten Island buyout after Hurricane Sandy, social vulnerability on an index of factors increased for 99% of participants, and 20% of participants were still as vulnerable to coastal flooding at their new address as they were before. The results suggest that participants struggle to find safe and appropriate housing, and this indicates that more research is needed to identify the factors that drove this increase in vulnerability. So when we first started thinking about this topic, I'd hoped to use some existing data sets and research to better understand the financial implications of managed retreat for individuals and households. We soon realized, though, that this is a topic area that isn't well understood and that doesn't have a lot of data, but is important to focus on moving forward. To that end, we want to highlight that collecting long-term household level data from buyout participants is critical to the future of managed retreat and buyout policy. Also crucial is making the connection between household financial well-being research and disaster financial literacy to the practice of disaster mitigation and managed retreat. We think that researchers, policymakers, and community leaders should be thinking about this because the financial inequalities of disasters are well documented, and the limited existing evidence on buyouts suggests that as a practice, it can contribute towards increased financial vulnerability and inequality too.
If you're wondering what you can do today, we did want to put some very practice-driven suggestions for curriculum and some focus areas. Of course, it's been mentioned earlier, but the cost-benefit analysis being a key focus too for individuals and households. The timescale of money and explaining the timescale of money has been a constant trend that we've seen throughout our courses and a key learning objective. And then just with the repetition of the confusion, navigating the financial incentive structures, focusing on policy, financial incentive literacy as well. And then on the next slide, we just have some examples of the courses that we do provide currently on these topics. So preparedness actions to promote economic resilience and recovery. And then we do have a suite of courses at ncdpcourses.org on improving financial literacy for both individuals and businesses. This is also our contact information. We hope to continue this conversation and the dialogue in the Q&A. So thank you everybody for your time.
Great, Chris and Joshua, thank you so much. Really great talk. We're going to unfortunately steamroll right ahead to our next talk, which is Managed Retreat, Heritage Justice and Community Resilience, presented by David Glassberg. David.
Great. Let me see if I can share this. Oops. Right there. There we go. Why can't I share this? Just a second. Oh, there it is.
Yep, we're seeing it.
Yep. There we go. So this presentation really builds on what A.R. Siders asked this morning, that question about whose history is being preserved. And so for the next 10 minutes or so, we want to explore that topic in a little more depth. And there's a lot of links and other things here, so I'm hoping people will want to download this at some point later. And apologies for reading it, but this is actually a good way for me to make sure I stick to my time limit. So climate disruption makes more urgent the work that we all do in our communities to protect places significant to local history and identity from deterioration and oblivion. Increased incidence of extreme heat, drought, wildfires, storms, floods, sea level rise threaten to overwhelm our best efforts, forcing communities to allow nature to take its course in some places. And heritage professionals who are dedicated to helping their communities to protect these important historical and archaeological sites also will be having to help their communities come to grips with losing many of these sites. Managed retreat demands that heritage professionals practice heritage justice, helping their communities to decide which historic places to protect, which to let go in a just and equitable manner. So I'm going to address 3 questions today. First, what is heritage justice and how concepts from environmental justice could inform the practice of heritage conservation? Secondly, the alternatives that exist for the protection and interpretation of heritage sites. And specifically, I'm interested in how displaced communities could mark and interpret important heritage sites that have already been lost to managed retreat. And third, how community conversations about local history facilitated by heritage organizations can help communities work through this experience of change and loss and become more resilient. So concerns about justice in heritage conservation arise in response to the National Park Service's very recent efforts to plan for a changing climate by setting priorities for managing and protecting what they believe are the most significant natural and cultural resources from its negative impacts. In coastal national parks, such as Cape Cod National Seashore, for example, it's far easier to find local support for protecting popular tourist attractions, such as lighthouses, than for protecting seldom visited archaeological sites. Concern about heritage justice also arises in coastal cities such as Bridgeport, Connecticut, where residents of Little Liberia, a historically Black neighborhood centered around the Mary and Elizabeth Freeman houses, which actually, if I've got a pointer, I can show you exactly where that is, protested that the initial strategies proposed in the city's climate adaptation plan would sacrifice sites of memory significant to them while protecting historic districts and neighborhoods inhabited primarily by affluent whites. And this is the most recent plan, which actually includes a little cutout to protect the Freeman houses. And of course, heritage justice concerns also arise in recent struggles by Indigenous peoples uprooted by climate change in Alaska and elsewhere to have their history remembered in the places they formerly called home. In the words of Dr. Christine Peterson of the Lonelanders Center, who works with the Ile de Charles Band of Biloxi, Chimacra, Choctaw, and Southern Louisiana on location, when all is gone, whose story will remain? So practicing heritage justice, here are the principles. It demands that in any plan for climate adaptation and managed retreat, heritage professionals critically interrogate whose history is being institutionalized, protected, and interpreted as the public one. It requires taking into account instances of past and ongoing environmental trauma and displacement, as well as identifying the individuals and forces responsible for that trauma and displacement. And insists that heritage professionals develop and implement, having trouble reading, democratic and inclusive processes for deciding which historic places will be protected from the impact of climate disruption and which stories about those places will be preserved. And it facilitates the remembrance of diverse cultures wherever they wind up as a result of managed retreat or other interventions in the places they formerly call home. Hello, why isn't this moving? This is an example from near me of marking managed retreat, where in the early 20th century, 4 towns in central Massachusetts were flooded to make the Quabbin Reservoir. And so here at an overlook, you can see that the history to some extent is being marked. So keeping these heritage justice considerations in mind, heritage professionals can take 3 actions in the face of managed retreat. The first is to organize public projects to help local residents identify their special places and the vulnerability of each of these to the impact of climate disruption. These sites of memory constitute what planner Randolph Hester has called the community's sacred spaces, or their subconscious landscapes of the heart. A few of these sites will be recognized on the National Register of Historic Places, but most will not. Using National Register criteria to prioritize the protection of historic places, given the processes through which these places have historically been nominated and included in the register, perpetuates heritage injustice. Heritage professionals can calculate a place's vulnerability as a function of both its location, its proximity to being in harm's way, and its capacity to withstand disruptive weather events. Secondly, with this information, heritage professionals could organize public programs to introduce local residents to the range of approaches that exist for the protection and interpretation of vulnerable historic structures and landscapes. Although the prospect of managed retreat suggests all or nothing, the National Park Service's recent cultural resource climate change strategy identifies several intermediate options, such as building new protective infrastructure or reinforcing, elevating, or relocating historic buildings. Heritage professionals can insist that allowing a historic place to be lost to managed retreat, usually the least expensive option, comes with the responsibility to document it carefully and facilitate its memorialization and interpretation. Through such public programs, heritage professionals can help their communities make informed decisions and navigate the conflicts that are inherent in finding the right approach for a particular historic place. And this is just an example, if you dig into the National Park Service document, of some of those options that are intermediate options between no active intervention or documenting and preparing for loss. And you can read these along the way at some point. Thirdly, in public programs, understanding the emotional difficulty of letting some historic places go, heritage professionals can facilitate community conversations about local history that address the experience of rupture, discontinuity, and help local residents anticipate their experiences of change and loss. Folklorist Henry Glassy insists, history is the essence of the idea of place. Our understanding of our immediate environment is really inseparable from the histories we experience in that environment and the stories we tell about it. By attaching history to places, we form emotional bonds with the familiar natural environments and historical environments we call home, and in the process develop a sense of ontological security, an understanding of our place in the world. As climates change significantly in only 3 generations, some of us will be physically displaced, and even those of us who stay put can feel displaced as our hometowns grow hotter and colder, wetter or drier, and have unfamiliar flora and fauna. Experiencing local environments substantially different from what we expect. I'm having trouble reading this. We experienced as children and the histories associated with those environments that acclimate us to place. Well, I'm having trouble reading this, but it's okay. Can become how it relates to our physical surroundings. I'm in trouble with this. So as a couple examples of those community conversations, in the fall of 2016, under the auspices of Cape Cod National Seashore, I organized a series of community conversations in 4 towns on the Outer Cape, exploring local history, the changing climate. At each meeting, I showed a mist of historical contemporary photographs, as well as images of likely future local sea level rise from the Climate Central Surging Seas tool, and recorded the conversations that the images prompted about recent social, economic, and environmental changes. And I actually published something about that, which people can have access to. I included that. And then the following spring in 2017, under the auspices of the Pioneer Valley Planning Commission, Arise for Social Justice, and Partners for a Healthier Community in Springfield, I created a timeline of Springfield, Massachusetts environmental history to accompany a series of 5 community meetings to develop a climate action and resilience plan for the city. 3 of these meetings occurred in majority African-American and Latinx neighborhoods, where the conversations about local history focused on places that exemplified the community's decades of struggle against social and economic inequality, poor air quality, and environmental injustice. In spring 21, the Springfield chapter of Neighbor to Neighbor repurposed the timeline as an interactive map in conjunction with the arrival of the Humanities Action Lab's traveling exhibit, Climates of Inequality, Stories of Environmental Justice, which included a panel on how the building of Interstate 91 through the north end of the city tore all these neighborhoods apart. Ecologist Eric Higgs observed continuity is maintained by the narratives we create to explain our place in the flow of things. Through community engaged history projects, such as the ones on Cape Cod and Springfield, heritage professionals can help communities place their experiences of climate disruption in historical context, provide opportunities in a communal setting to process their concerns about the future, to grieve the impending loss of places that matter to them, and to express their desire for refuge and repair. Contemplating managed retreat and the future impact of climate disruption understandably raises fear. Public history projects that engage communities in discussions of the relationships of their past to their present and future can help local residents to work through those fears and build resilience and capacity for collective action. That's it.
Great timing. Thank you, David. Really interesting, the role of history and heritage professionals in helping communities hang on to their heritage. So we will now turn to our next to the last presentation. And again, I encourage folks to put questions in the chat as we go along. This next presentation is called Mediating Retreat, Just Relocation, Collective Ownership, and Spatial Practice at Proyecto ENLACE, Puerto Rico. And Lizzie Yaring will be doing the presentation.
Do you see my presentation mode? Not my notes?
Yes.
Great.
Unfortunately, we're getting a lot of digital access.
So yeah, my name is Lizzie Yarina. I'm a PhD candidate at the MIT. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a rainstorm. I think it might be affecting my connection. Is that any better?
Yes, although unfortunately we've lost your slides now.
Oh, okay, I was just switching my microphone system. What about now?
Not great, I have to say. I don't know, Mantita, do you have by any chance a backup copy so that you could advance the slides for Lizzie and then she can save her bandwidth for her audio?
Oh, I do not have it, but Lizzie, you can send it to me and I can share it right now.
Yeah, because it's unfortunately you're really, we're having an issue. If you're willing to do that, maybe I'm going to suggest if we can turn on a dime and ask John Nelson. John,
I turned off my video. I don't know if that helps at all.
I mean, we can try it. That wasn't great, but let's see.
Okay.
Okay, great. So let's John, I don't know if you're able to jump in on short notice, for which I apologize. But I think it'll give Lizzie a chance to get her slides sent in, and then we can try to proceed that way. So John Nelson from Brown University is going to give a talk on town governmental capacity and barriers to adaptation, a case study of the community rating system.
Thank you so much, Richard. Let's see if I can get this.
Great, and thanks again for your flexibility.
Not a problem. So let's see if this will go into slideshow.
Yep.
Okay. But now how do I see my presenter mode? Oh well. Let's see. Use presenter view. But now are you guys seeing presenter view? You are, right?
Yeah, we are.
That's not great. Okay. So I'm gonna cheat and do this because I want to be able to see my notes. So just humor me, I guess. Sorry about that. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about limits to CRS participation in Rhode Island. This is part of my dissertation research where I'm looking at the CRS and its effects on promoting adaptation in New England more broadly, but my qualitative chapters focus more specifically on Rhode Island because that's where I'm based, and it's actually quite a good case. So in this presentation, I want to talk specifically about differences in municipal preparation for flooding due to sea level rise caused by climate change. This comes after my first chapter where I demonstrate that despite its stated goal, the CRS does not increase open space acquisitions among communities, and I cast doubt on its overall ability to promote adaptation. And that leads me to ask, okay, if it's not helping communities be more resilient, then why do they participate? So that's sort of the motivation going into this talk. So a couple abbreviations: National Flood Insurance Program, I'll say NFIP; CRS, Community Rating System, I'll say CRS. Most of you are probably familiar with those acronyms, right? So why does it matter? As you all are, I know, definitely aware, there's a huge variation in how much coastal towns are doing to prepare for sea level rise. But our understanding, it's a new problem, right? So we don't really understand why the variation is happening. CRS is used as an indicator by a lot of studies. People will look at it as a proxy for adaptation. Okay, because the community is doing well in the CRS, then we can assume it's doing well on adaptation compared to communities that are not in the CRS or communities that are more poorly ranked in the CRS. But that presupposes that the CRS is equally accessible to all communities. And it also gives us some insight into federal, local interventions, right? So CRS is sort of a case of, right, the sort of voluntary initiatives that communities, municipalities can engage with at the local level, at the federal level, right? It's like federal hazard mitigation grants, community development block grants, those sort of things. It turns out require similar capabilities as participating in the CRS, right? So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about what is the CRS, the findings that led me to ask these questions, and I'll talk about why participate and why not participate, and some conclusions that I've drawn. So what is the CRS? It's a voluntary program that any NFIP participating community can join. It incentivizes them, but they say it incentivizes communities to reduce their flood risk, right? And so you get awarded points for doing certain things, whether that's making flood insurance rate maps available at the library or buyouts. You can get a lot of points for buyouts. Turns out hardly anybody does those and claims points for them, but you can get points for buyouts. And it's been around for about 30 years. Only 5% of NFIP communities are in it, but those 5% of communities have about 70% of all the National Flood Insurance Program policies. And it's cost neutral, meaning that basically everybody pays the cost of the program. It's distributed across all policyholders. So we're starting off from my first chapter, where the CRS, I find, does not influence towns' adaptation behavior. I'd be happy to talk about that more later, if you like. My work is a little bit unique because it uses longitudinal data that is more robust to supporting causal inference. But this is sort of the takeaway from that first chapter that led me to these questions. This basically shows communities join CRS at time t, and they did not seem to change their open space acquisition as their preservation of undeveloped land in the flood zone before or after participating, joining the CRS. Happy to talk more about it. And we see this pattern across other activities, right? So map data availability, anybody can, any community looks like can post their maps on the internet or put them in the library. Flood protection assistance has dwindled off. Flood data maintenance has increased, and open space has been, fairly stagnant as well. So it doesn't appear that communities are really responding to the program once they're in it. So if it's that easy, right? If you don't really have to change anything you're doing, why wouldn't you join, right? So there's a couple different angles there. The findings I'm going to share with you are based on over 50 interviews with local planners, CRS officials, state level planning, environment, and coastal officials. I went through a list of officials, but I also had people recommend to me people with whom I should speak. The technical term being snowball sampling in sociology. The key question really I'm focusing on here is, how does the CRS benefit your community, and why does or doesn't your town participate? And so why participate, right? So the first thought is this is a classic collective action problem, right? The benefit accrues to NFIP policyholders whether or not they push the town to join the CRS. So participation will be limited because regardless of whether or not you push for that, you're going to benefit from it, right? And so I asked, right? And it turns out that policyholders are unaware. As far as the planners are concerned, they could, they have no idea that they're getting a discount. And so the idea that policyholders are lobbying for a benefit is out. However, these planners do report that the discount is their primary motivation for participation. I asked an open-ended question, what's the benefit? They tell me it's the discount. They don't say that it's reduction in flood risk, which I found a very interesting omission, right? So, all right, so if you're, don't need to change anything, right? Why not participate in the program, right? Why not simply secure the discount and, feel like you're doing something good for your community? It comes down to this, it's bureaucratic capacity. We've heard about this from other speakers today, but my findings, it's either need to be big or you need to be rich, right? So all planners spoke positively of the CRS. Nobody thinks it's a bad program. Nobody is like, oh, I would never join that. No. Rather, it's prohibitively time consuming. It's a bureaucratic undertaking. It's a lot of paperwork, and some planning offices don't have the time or the staff to do that. And the only communities that can undertake the documentation needed for participation are ones with large planning teams or ones that can hire a CRS consultant, as I believe we heard mentioned earlier today. And so these are a couple of quotes from a planner from a non-CRS community, and his town council wants him to join, right? He talks about in the past how another department has resisted participating because of the amount of administrative work needed to make it effective. He'd like to do it, but there's not enough hours in the day to push it forward, right? And he thinks this, fits in the larger adaptation dynamic, right? They believe, planners, they see what's coming, right? They know the things that we're talking about more or less. They're things that, we could and should be doing for the citizens of our community, but they cost money, and towns, either don't want to or can't allocate the budget to do those things, right? And talking to a CRS official, it's a challenge to keep up the records for CRS, right? It's not that they're not doing it, they probably are, right? Which goes back to my finding that they're not really changing what they're doing because of the program. It's just a matter of showing it, right? Okay, so I did a little statistical analysis. I got a list of planners from the state of Rhode Island, coded communities of whether or not they had 2 or more planners. Because a lot of it, the complaints I got were from single planner departments where they just had nobody available to them. And you see, they're basically, if you don't have 2 or more planners, you're not in the CRS. It's pretty stark, right? And the probability of this happening due to chance is less than 2/100ths. And indeed, some planners may choose not to participate because they feel it distorts the flood insurance price signal of flooding risk, right? A planner in Connecticut said, you know, people don't need to be living on the coast. If I get in the CRS, it's like, you know, suggesting to them that, okay, here's a discount so you can keep living here. And so they avoided joining, but I didn't notice that in Rhode Island. Or maybe there's too few flood insurance policies for the discount to be an incentive, right? You might have a large coastal population, but if many of them don't have flood insurance, then what's the point in joining the CRS, right? If your motivation is the discount. So what is it good for? Why do communities bother participating? Requires little change to enter. But communities, once they're in the program, they stand to lose the discount should they deviate from NFIP regulations. And the potential of jeopardizing that discount provides planners leverage against developers, because all the NFIP policyholders in a community would suffer if the town granted a variance that went against the flood code, right? The building code. And so instead of, you know, saying, oh, this is going to flood in 20 years or whatever, planners can instead point to a very clear cost that the community will suffer if they do not stick to the codes, right? So I think I hear a beeping. Is that my time?
I'm sorry to say so, the gong.
That is fine. This is sort of my conclusion. It goes back to our discussions of equity and inequality that we've been talking about today. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, John. Thanks a lot. That's really fascinating to hear about the capacity limits of smaller communities for a program that really should be helpful to them, and how few of them are able to participate. So we'll hopefully come back to that. So now we've improvised getting Lizzie's slides up. And I think they're going to come up, and Manchita is going to be projecting them. And so again, this is Lizzie Yarina talking about mediating retreat. Lizzie, please.
And how is my sound quality now? Do I sound okay?
Yeah, you sound great, loud and clear.
Okay. Thank you so much for everyone's help getting through that technical difficulty. So I'm a PhD candidate at the MIT Department of Urban Studies and Planning, and this presentation is in collaboration with Larissa Valles and Miha Mazareu of the MIT Urban Risk Lab and MIT Architecture. And this builds on a paper that we published in 2019 in the Journal of Landscape Architecture. Next. So while designers are increasingly interested in unbuilding, subtracting, and even retreating to floating islands as approaches to adapt the built environment to climate change, there are a few successful examples of community relocations. In the context of post-disaster relocations, architects, planners, and landscape architects often have produced proposals that are out of touch with the needs, interests, and practices of those exposed to environmental risks. Next. Our presentation highlights what we believe is a promising community-led approach to managed retreat, cited in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Project ENLACE is significant in its attention to social, environmental, and economic justice across multiple scales, and also for its connection of grassroots organizing with state and federal policies and support. As architects and planners ourselves, we are particularly interested in the roles played by spatial experts in this process, in particular, what this case can tell us about the possible roles for design experts in the creation of more equitable and just approaches to retreat. The community around El Caño Martín Peño, like many in Greater San Juan, Puerto Rico, was settled following the failure of the government to address the Puerto Rican housing crisis from the 1940s and 1950s, and people responded through organized collective land settlements, or what the residents termed rescues. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, and still in some cases today, the very existence of these communities was met with violent government response. Past disasters have often been leveraged by territory government actors with federal support as mechanisms to displace what they have deemed informal settlements. One example is Villas del Sol, a predominantly Dominican municipality of Toa Baja, founded in the mid-1990s. After Hurricane George in 1998, Villas del Sol was declared a flood zone and became part of a FEMA project for relocating multiple settlements. Many of these relocated community members, lacking alternatives, returned and later found they were again forcibly removed on the basis of occupying a FEMA flood zone. They were again promised land rebuy for relocation, which also proved to be flood prone, and families returned again, perpetuating the cycle of retreat and return. So following Hurricane Maria in 2017, some municipalities directly proposed plans for relocating residents out of flood zones with the sole purpose of eliminating informal settlements. CDBG-DR funding allocations in some cases were proposed to be used for relocation of around 9,000 households. The specter of flood risk and the associated displacement of informal communities has been used to make room for high-end development in Greater San Juan, as occurred in the community of Vietnam, which is across the bay from downtown San Juan. The creation of the ENLACE project, which we'll be talking about more, was spurred by concerns of a similar fate for El Caño Martín Peña. This community was founded after two large hurricanes in the 1930s, which, in combination with the island's industrialization, led rural families to occupy the wetlands around the tidal channel called El Caño Martín Peña in the San Juan Bay estuary. These arrabales grew to be some of the most densely populated areas in Puerto Rico, with over 26,000 people within the 8 communities along El Caño. Over time, the deteriorating conditions of the channel led to pollution and flooding, and the community has also lacked sufficient sanitation and water infrastructure. Over time, this is just a diagram kind of highlighting some of those historical events. In the 1970s, next slide, the community of Tokyo, Hato-Rei, on the opposite side of the channel, was expropriated by the government without offering families an alternative housing option. It is now a mid to high class financial district known as the Golden Mile. So in El Caño Martín Peña, health and flood hazards associated with the polluted channel, as in addition to the looming threat of displacement, led to a call for dredging the channel and establishing a long-term vision by and for the communities which surrounded it. The G8, a nonprofit organization that brings together community leaders from the 8 communities surrounding the channel, created a plan for action, leading to the creation of the Corporation for Project ENLACE of the Caño Martín Peña, and a participatory planning process led to the creation of new legislation at the level of the territory, Law 489, which created both ENLACE and the Community Land Trust. ENLACE is a public corporation legislatively created in 2002 to implement a comprehensive plan for making the community more resilient to flooding and other risks. It borrows strategies from the Proyecto Peninsula de Cantera, which is the first community-led public corporation in Puerto Rico, formed as a result of redevelopment pressure after Hurricane Hugo in 1989. Fundamental to both organizations' agendas is empowering the communities themselves to be the main agents of change, and the plan's design and implementation revolves around an inclusive participatory action planning process. Alongside the ENLACE Corporation, the Community Land Trust for Martín Peña is a private nonprofit organization created to manage the land and prevent residents from being priced out. The Land Trust, a model for collective land ownership where each family has individual rights over their plot, protects residents from gentrification and eviction. The CLT or Community Land Trust also secures affordable housing options and provides housing opportunities for families undergoing relocation. The community collectively owns 200 acres of land across the participating communities, allowing them to directly benefit from the improvement efforts of the project. The creations of these institutions required a lot of time, passion, and hard work for those involved in advocating for them. There were initially many protests to fight for the Land Trust, but the G8 now holds a lot of political power in the city. Funding and support comes from a number of sources, including $150 million granted by the government for the implementation of the comprehensive land use plan. And much of this funding went to large infrastructure projects and the dredging of the canal. Further funding from various grants and awards includes the EPA and the UN World Habitat Award. The plan was the result of over 700 community participation activities to promote effective participatory planning and decision-making coordinated by ENLACE. Strong and ongoing community engagement and self-determination is a key focus of the organization. There is also an overall focus on socioeconomic and community development, empowering residents, especially the youth in the community, through a series of social and educational programs and activities. ENLACE's comprehensive development and land use plan revolves around the dredging of the channel. Ecologically sensitive design strategies will create new green space and recreation spaces in combination with green infrastructure for stormwater and wastewater sewer systems. More than 1,000 families require relocation in order to make room for the channel expansion, but these relocations are in community as infill housing and are occurring incrementally beginning in 2015. As of 2020, 600 families had already been moved into safe housing, prioritizing those who were at highest risk. The relocation process is explained clearly and multiple times at meetings, presentations, and community participation activities hosted by trusted community members, ensuring people understand the entire process. And there's also a relocation committee composed of trusted community leaders and residents from the various communities that inform and guide residents through the process. Residents look for available houses and choose 3 options that are inspected by the committee to ensure that they are safe, sanitary, and decent. They have 3 options: either the renovation of an existing housing unit to be more resilient elsewhere in the community, new infill housing construction, which could be single family or multifamily, and these were created through a participatory design process. So at the moment, this is an ongoing project anticipated to be completed by 2029. While there were some delays following Hurricane Maria, when restrictions on CDBG funding in FEMA flood zones initially blocked access to federal post-disaster funding. However, through their strong political voice in the city, the project has been able to continue to move forward. All adaptation projects, including retreat, have trade-offs. This project in particular is designed to prevent development-induced displacement and gentrification. However, residents continue to live in a floodplain and there is some risk of flooding. If this flood risk is greatly reduced through green infrastructure projects and resilient housing designs. And they are further able to retain land tenure, the community, and livelihoods, which are keeping them right near the center of the city of San Juan. The emphasis on long-term self-determination reflects the project's social and economic justice dimensions, and the creation of a community land trust, or CLT, across 8 connected communities avoids the potential of green gentrification of these residents in the future, which points to a concern with equity over time. In terms of environmental justice, by reducing flooding and environmental pollution in a district with insufficient sanitation infrastructure, the green infrastructure also has cross-scalar benefits in terms of reducing flooding within and beyond the community. The design also projects improved water quality throughout the adjacent channel, which, by restoring the connection between the San Juan Bay and San Jose Lagoon, will improve biodiversity, including fish habitats. Further, the project is part of a horizontal knowledge sharing strategy, including the Urban Waters Learning Network. allowing them to share knowledge and expertise next. So I think I'm almost out of time, but I just want to say briefly a note about kind of design and planning practice. So design is fundamental to ENLACE's intermediary role between the G8 and the CLT and the territory government. The corporation staff is interdisciplinary, including architects, landscape architects, planners, and urban designers. So this space in between the kind of what CIDers at all call strategic and managed retreat, designers play an important role in addressing both immediate concerns of those in the community, as well as larger adaptation issues within the urban and ecological contexts. In terms of best practices, the case suggests that when models are adapted to place, as they inevitably are, it is important to address the multiple dimensions and scales of equity. And in the context of technical expertise, ENLACE's interdisciplinary staff suggests a role for professional spatial disciplines as this kind of intermediary between community activism and larger plans and policies. The ENLACE case highlights that while it is important to acknowledge adaptation trade-offs and orientation towards multiple dimensions of equity and justice, supported by cross-scalar thinking, can provide potential for overlapping and reinforcing contributions to equity. Designers and planners placing emphasis on local specificity can help larger strategies meet the ground in a more equitable way. And just if you want to learn a little bit more, this is the article that I mentioned. Please contact me if you'd like a copy. And the project is also included in the MIT Venice Biennale exhibition, Moving Together, one of the case studies. I just want to say thank you to my collaborators and the folks at ENLACE who helped support this research. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lizzie. Really fascinating. And you anticipated one of the questions I had, which was how did the planners not kind of fall into making mistakes as facilitators and, kind of heightening potential tensions within the community about different interests, wanting different outcomes and so forth in the relocation process. And I think the answer you provided was the interdisciplinarity of the team. And it really strikes me that today's presentations provide a kind of a model for that interdisciplinarity, because each of the talks have addressed some of those questions about building trust, maintaining knowledge and engagement of communities, but from very different disciplinary perspectives. So thank you all for that. My best efforts notwithstanding, we only have 5 minutes left until the end of the session. And I see that there've been a couple of questions. One which Malgosia has already answered. And then there was another comment on the Sandy impacted neighborhoods, which I think was going to Chris and Josh. And then one general question from Bill DaCosta about the use of hard infrastructure as a strategy for protecting against sea level rise. And it looks like one new one has come in as well on FEMA's loss avoidance. This is also for Joshua and Chris, FEMA's loss avoidance. So I don't know if I'm just going to ask folks to comment if you wish on the on Bill DaCosta's question. Please keep comments really brief, and we'll get through as many of these as we can. So he was just asking about the use of hard infrastructure for protection, and whether he says that it seems to be working in his area in Hawaii, but would you suggest more of these walls to continue protection? I don't know if anybody wants to take a quick swipe at that one. All right, well, let's go Chris and Josh. Bill, I think the answer is it depends. And it really depends on partly what the community would like, and also a lot on the geomorphology and some of the physical characteristics of the area in question and what you're trying to protect.
Can I just jump in really quick, just to add it does depend. And one of the things that you may want to look into in deciding is what are the flood projections for the area? What kind of increase in water levels are you expecting, and how long, would something like that wall be effective?
Great. Thanks, Malgosia. Joshua and Chris, I don't know if you want to address the question about state-led or FEMA's loss avoidance studies and whether you considered those when you were doing your research.
Yeah, sure. We can quickly address that one. I also just want to highlight Elizabeth's comment as well from earlier. We did not look at FEMA's loss avoidance studies. We typically were looking at peer-reviewed research out in the academic space that was looking at participant results in buyouts. And then to Elizabeth's question from earlier, they asked about, they had a comment about a house-by-house overlap between homeowners who were impacted by the mortgage foreclosure crisis of the late 2000s and then homes that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy. This is exactly related to our research. I think our interests are really in how disasters of any kind, whether that be an economic disaster or a natural disaster, impact homes, financial situations. And I think this is a great example that you've raised up of people not being able to participate in the buyout program, potentially because of the double whammy that they received from back-to-back crises. Really important point, and thank you for bringing it up. It's something that we want to understand more about and how that shapes decision-making and participation and eligibility as well.
Great. So I'm just going to jump to what I understand is the last question. The previous one actually asks about a specific instance, and I encourage any from the panel to look up our questioner on the website to provide direct response. But the last question is just to Lizzie on how the communities in Puerto Rico got introduced to the CLT model and where did they get the assistance to implement.
I can't recall the precise history, but I know that this project has been a part of a kind of horizontal knowledge sharing about community land trusts. And there's a recent book where this is included as a case on Common Ground, John Emmanuel Davis, which is specifically about community land trusts. But I think in terms of how they were able to access the expertise, there's really strong connection between the kind of grassroots community organization and a strong existing coalition of communities, and also the creation of a territory level legislation which created the land trust and the public corporation. So there's this kind of support from the bottom and the top that I think is really important to maintaining the momentum, and also the kind of institutional and expertise support that's necessary to do the project at this scale.
Great, thank you. And I certainly agree with the last comment here that the ENLACE project is an inspiration. So thanks a lot for sharing it. So I just want to thank all the speakers. I want to thank you in the audience for participating. This is a great session. I wish we had a little bit longer to explore some of the connections across this diverse body of work. And I encourage you to stay engaged with the rest of the workshop and the conference. It's really going to be great. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Richard. Appreciate it.
I guess we might as well leave this one.